There's a common confusion outside of serious biology. I mean, natural selection is a factor in evolution. No serious biologist doubts that. But it's one of many factors. For example, mutation's a factor. I mean, there are many other factors. For example, if you just take a look at our own genetic endowment, a lot of it comes from transposition.
When you talk about the endowment, you think that we have a way to comprehend the world within ourselves, and we can only comprehend the world up to this limit?
Yeah, that's just Hume. That's Newton and Hume. So you try to discover what is this cognitive endowment that we have. That it is a fixed cognitive endowment is not really arguable unless you think we're angels. But if we're part of the organic world, we have fixed capacities. Just like I can't fly, These capacities have a certain scope and they have certain limits. That's the nature of organic capacities. Then comes the question, okay, what are they? In fact, one of the striking things is what I just mentioned. Our cognitive endowment sort of compels us to regard the world in mechanical terms. We know that's wrong, but we can't help seeing the world like that. If you look at the moon rising in the early evening, at the horizon it's big, then it gets smaller and smaller. It's called the moon illusion. We know it's not true, but you can't help seeing it.
Well, I thought of it a lot, and I know it's one of the paradox, but I think our brain zoom. It's like if you see the world through a window which has a far distance, and you will see a bridge in a distance, and the window delimits your attention, then you would feel the bridge is much bigger than what it is.
I mean, now you're trying to give an explanation, and there's been a lot of work on what the explanation is. But whatever, and it's not so trivial, but whatever the explanation is, we can't help seeing it, okay? We just see it, just like we can't help thinking that the world works by physical interaction, contact. Some other part of our brain tells us it's not true because of theories that have been developed that say it can't work like that. But that can't change our perception and interpretation because that's just fixed.
So we see a tree and we understand it's a tree. Does it mean that our brain is equipped with a fixed capacity that tells us this is a tree?
Here's another question where it's good to be puzzled. How do we identify something as a tree? It's not so simple. So for example, you plant a tree, say a willow tree, which is a good example. It grows. At some point you cut a branch off it and you put that branch in the ground. Suppose it grows and it becomes exactly identical to the original tree. I suppose the original tree is cut down. Is that new one the same willow tree? Why not? It's genetically identical, it has all the same properties, but we know it's not the same tree. Why not? I mean, and if you go further, it turns out our concept of tree or rock or person or anything is extremely intricate. And furthermore, see, here's what I think is just a classic error that runs right through philosophy and psychology and linguistics right up to the moment. That's the idea that words, say, meaning-bearing elements, like, say, tree or person or John Smith or anything, pick out something in the extra-mental world, something that a physicist could identify. So that if I have a word, say, cow, it refers to something, and a scientist knowing nothing about my brain could figure out what counts as a cow. That's just not true. That's why you have classic books with names like Words and Object, Word and Object, Quine's major book, or Words and Things, Roger Brown's major book. That referentialist assumption is simply false about humans. I mean, it's true of animals. Like, as far as we know of animal communication, yeah, that's actually true. But for humans, it's simply untrue. And furthermore, every infant knows it. And that poses a huge evolutionary problem. Where'd that come from? It imposes an acquisition problem, a descriptive problem, an evolutionary problem. It's never been looked at because everyone assumes, well, there's just a relationship. That's like assuming things move to their natural place. We're never going to have a real understanding of semantics unless those illusions are thrown out.
Well, something that always struck me since I was young is like you get a representation of the world by symbols first. Like logically, you would see a dog, and then you would see a drawing of a dog and make the connection. But in your life, you get exposed to a representation of a dog in a very actually simplified way. and then you go to the, or let's say you go outside and you see a real dog.
Yeah, the trouble is that's not the way it works. Yeah, that's very commonsensical, just false.
No, I'm not. I'm saying it's how it's exposed. Like we what
It makes sense, and every work on philosophy or linguistics says exactly that. This just happens to be false. And furthermore, every infant knows it. Fairy stories are based on the fact that it's false. Like take a fairy story that any child understands.
No, I'm not saying the child believes it's a real dog. What I'm saying is that
that's not the point. We do not identify dogs in terms of their physical characteristics. We identify dogs, for example, in terms of a property of psychic continuity. Like if a witch turns a dog into a camel, and then some fairy princess kisses the camel and turns back to a dog. It's been a dog all along, even when it looked like a camel. I mean, that's the basis of fairy tales.
I was not saying that it's the way we understand it.
Psychic continuity is not a physical property.
Mm-hmm.
It's a property that we impose on things. So therefore, there is no hope for finding a way of identifying the things that are related to symbols by looking at their physical properties. They're individuated, they're identified in terms of our mental constructions. So they're basically mental objects. And that means the whole referentialist concept has to be thrown out, and you have to look at the relation of language to the world in some different fashion.
So, and do you think we constructed the world in mirroring this image we had in our mind?
We do it, but we don't do it the way philosophers and linguists think we do it. We certainly do it. So, for example, sure, we see the world in terms of trees and dogs and rivers and so on. But then the question is, well, what are those concepts? Now, the standard assumption is those concepts are linked to physical, identifiable physical things in the extramental world. And that assumption is just false. Mm-hmm. And unless we rid ourselves of that assumption, we won't be able to understand the way thought and language relates to the world. But that's a topic that's just taboo in philosophy and psychology. So they're stuck. They're like mechanics pre-Galileo, where everything went to its natural place. Well, as long as you keep to that for thousands of years, you're never going to understand the mechanics of the world. That's why I think these are the kinds of reasons why it makes very good sense to think back to the earliest stages of the scientific revolution. Not Einstein, that's too sophisticated. Let's go to the earliest stages where people had that credible intellectual breakthrough, and they said, let's be puzzled about what seems obvious. So why should we take it to be obvious that if I let go of a ball, it goes down and not up? Mm-hmm. I mean, it's sort of obvious, but why? Well, as soon as you're willing to ask that question, you get the beginnings of modern science. If you're not willing to ask that question, you say, well, it goes down because it belongs on the ground. No science develops.
You talk in length about how we try to interpret the world and how we ought to throw away what's believed in linguistics or philosophy. You say, why do we recognize that this is a different tree when it's been cut and it grows and it's identical? And since then I read about genetics, and that's a clone basically when you reproduce. It's asexual reproduction, so it's a clone, so it's potentially identical. But the only answer I could give was that I know it's a different tree because I saw somebody come and cut it and then grow again. Mm-hmm. So I was thinking it's probably less trivial than that.
Well, actually, I think that's a real point there. Part of our concept of a tree has to do with a certain pretty abstract notion of continuity. So the original tree has a continuous existence, which we impose on it, because genetically speaking, the branch that was cut off is the same object. Yeah. But when it becomes a tree, it doesn't have the kind of continuity that we interpret as continuity. I mean, a different intelligence could interpret continuity quite differently and say that the new one is the real tree. That's our conception of continuity. Yeah. And it's a very complex one. So, for example, there's a children's story which my grandchildren liked when they were little. It's a story about a donkey named Sylvester, and something happens and it turns Sylvester into a rock. And the rest of the story is the rock, Sylvester, trying to explain to his parents parent donkeys, that it's really their baby Sylvester. And since children's stories have happy endings, something else happens and it turns them back to Sylvester and everybody's happy. Well, the children understand that the rock, though it has none of the properties of a donkey, physical properties, and has all the properties of a rock, is really Sylvester. And for example, if he was turned into a camel later, something would be a jar. He's got to come back and be what he is, Sylvester. All right, what that tells you is that without any instruction, of course, an infant understands a certain special kind of continuity. It's a very specific kind, much more abstract even in the case of the tree. But there's a kind of psychic continuity that we impose, that's part of the interpretation we impose on the world that identifies the objects that are around us, whether it's persons or rivers or rocks or trees or anything else.
I think I have an example that maybe make me understand the concept. When I meet a friend that I didn't see for 20 years and his appearance is completely different, first I feel I'm meeting a different person. And then in the course of the conversation, and it's generally 20 minutes, 30 minutes, this person become my friend. And the old image of my friend, like his picture, become younger than he is. So I readjust, and I was wondering if this is a phenomenon that everybody perceive.
All the time. I mean, we...
But is this the same phenomenon that we apply to object?
Yeah, same as with objects, like the tree or a river. Or, let's say take the Charles River over there, the river going past the building. What makes it the Charles River? You can have substantial physical changes, and it would still be the Charles River. So, for example, you can reverse the direction, still be the Charles River. You can break it up into tributaries that end up somewhere else and would still be the Charles River. You can change the content. So maybe you build a manufacturing plant upstream and the content is mostly arsenic, let's say. Well, it's still the Charles River. On the other hand, there are very small changes that you can make, in which case it won't be the Charles River at all. So suppose you put panels along the side so it goes in a straight path, and you start using it to ship freight up and down. It's not the river anymore, it's a canal.
Oh, yes.
And I suppose you make some minimal physical change, almost undetectable change, which hardens it. It's called a phase change, undetectable, but it makes it glass, basically. And you paint a line down the middle, and people start using it to commute to Boston. It's a highway, it's not a river. No, somehow we can go on and on like this. We understand all these things without instruction, without experience. They have to do with very complex notions of continuity of entities. A physicist cannot detect because they're not part of I mean, of course, the physical world is part of them, but it's only one part. A major part of how we identify anything in the world, no matter how elementary, is the mental conceptions that we impose on interpreting very fragmentary experience. And our experience is indeed very fragmentary. So visual experience is just, stimulations of the retina. But we impose an extremely rich interpretation of it, including things like, say, continuity. Actually, a lot of science fiction is based on this. So if somebody's in a spaceship and they go somewhere else and they reappear. Well, I've watched my kids watching these things. They understand immediately that it's the same person who appeared over there, that there's no continuity. On the other hand, I ask them sometimes, well, suppose that he had this teleportation or whatever it's called, and he appears over there, and suppose he's still here. Which one is the person? At that point, you get confused.
Yeah.
You don't know, because our conceptions don't give an answer to that. Actually, there are classical philosophical problems that are based on this. One famous one, what's called the ship of Theseus, goes back to the Greeks. Suppose that Theseus has a ship and he's on the ocean, and one of the boards falls off, so he throws it into the sea, and they put another board there. Still the ship of Theseus. Well, suppose this keeps happening until every board has been replaced. Still the ship of Theseus. Suppose someone on the shore has been collecting all these boards and reconstructs what in fact was the actual original ship. That's not the ship of Theseus. It's the one that Theseus is on. even though it's the other one that's physically identical to it. This one isn't. So there's no point trying to solve the philosophical problem. The problem is an epistemological one. It's something about the nature of our cognitive systems. So it appears that, as far as I've understood, non-human animals have a direct connection between the symbolic representations in their minds and identifiable physical events in the world. So you take a vervet monkey, which has alarm calls, and apparently those alarm calls are triggered automatically by a certain movement of leaves in a tree, which they give a predator call, and apparently it's reflexive.